Britain used to be great at building things, at making things happen, designing institutions and making life better, but we seem to have lost our way. Some people are saying that Britain is ungovernable in 2026. What went wrong and what can we do to try and correct it? Is it about economics and the need for growth? Is it about the relationship between people and politicians? Or are politicians just saying and doing the wrong things? I'm joined today on Politics Unchained by Jeremy Hardie. Now, he is a political historian and economist, which seems like a good place to start. Jeremy, when you look at the state of Britain today, what worries you the most?
When, for some reason or other, you think things have gone wrong, one of the things you slip into is being extremely judgmental and extremely critical, and it's all the fault of that stupid person who's in charge, who, incidentally, I really wanted to be all-powerful and all-wonderful.
That's a really big paradox, isn't it?
It's a really big paradox, yes. And a lot of this problem, if this problem is particularly severe at the moment, and I suspect it is particularly severe at the moment, we've always got a bit of it. Part of it is sheer fantasy on the part of the electorate about what you can legitimately expect of politicians, whoever they may be.
So this isn't about explaining away the problems because of global economics or conflict. This is about us needing to get real on what we can expect. But can't we expect at least our political leaders to have a vision and a bit of a plan?
Well, again, I think that's a very strong claim. If you think of the past, you can imagine that certainly with hindsight, and an awful lot of this was hindsight, you can imagine Churchill having a plan in 1940, and the plan was, roughly speaking, winning the war and doing so by keeping the United States on side. So if you said to Churchill, "What are you up to?" he could utter those two propositions, and you say, "Aha, that's a plan." You can just about say in 1945 that the Labour Party had a plan which involved more state intervention through nationalisation and so on, and more welfare, and a general move in the direction of policy, in the direct direction of the state being more powerful and us being more generous to the less well-off. I think Mrs. Thatcher had a plan. There were things very badly wrong with what the trade unions were doing, and there were some things that were very badly wrong with the way the economy worked. So she could tell a story. But generally, if you take Blair, who after all was a very successful politician, his plan didn't go very much beyond saying trite things like education. So again, I think it's an aspect of what I was saying before. We do require a lot of politicians, that they should tell us a story which is, as it were, it has to be coherent. It forms a coherent whole, which they then execute. And we're deeply disappointed if all they do is say, we're going to run the economy or the politics as well as we can, and we got 4 or 5 really good ideas. That sort of doesn't count.
I don't know. The 4 or 5 really good ideas sounds like something I could certainly market and would want to hear.
Indeed. I mean, if at the moment suppose you said that the interesting questions you have to deal with is what do we do about immigration? Yeah. What would you do about the common market? And what would we do about welfare?
Yeah.
Although those are very serious policy issues, I think we would be a little disappointed to hear that what the Prime Minister thinks we ought to do is deal with three rather specific, rather troublesome policy problems.
But these are things that certainly on the left and to some extent in the centre ground, politicians have shied away from a bit.
Absolutely, yes.
Why is that? Is this about expectations again and wanting to not over promise?
I think there is for heaven's sake, you're a politician and I'm not, and you will know far better than I that you're as a politician need to try to please lots of people lots of the time. It's very, very hard to satisfy.
Yeah.
And it isn't true of most walks of life. It is evidently true that if you're running a business like a supermarket chain, you want to please lots of people. But if you discover that a quarter of the people don't like your food aisle, but the other 3/4 do, that's fine. Yeah. But there's a little bit of a problem with politicians, isn't there? You will tell me. I don't know, that you sort of want to get the other quarter as well.
Yeah. I think it's because the general satisfaction that maybe a customer has with a supermarket probably comes from a fairly small range of variables.
Yes.
To do with price, value,
yes,
experience, and maybe brand positioning.
Yes.
I don't think those things actually don't cross over into politics. I think that probably certainly brand and the sense of what this political party is about, what it's is important.
What does it think matters?
What is it offering? We talk about retail politics. I don't really like the phrase retail politics, but it's supposed to sort of mean, well, how are we going to sell this to the electorate? What are they going to hear when we speak about this idea? I think the biggest problem in politics is that we're not very good at making trade-offs or articulating them. And it's something which I think Thatcher was pretty good at saying. She was quite comfortable saying, I'm going to do this. This is what's happening. I don't agree with you. I don't agree with this. And
yes, I think,
a lot of them.
Yeah, indeed. I think she was good at articulating choices, partly because, of course, she was, and it is quite an advantage, she was, in certain ways, a quite authoritarian and dogmatic person.
Yeah.
So it sort of came naturally for her to say things in rather a blunt way, which had as an implication, and I don't really care what you think.
But I think people respond to this, don't they? But people want this, don't they? They want to be led.
I think they want to be. I think they want to be led, at least in the soft sense.
Yeah.
They want people to articulate policies, whether you call them a coherent plan or not.
Yeah.
I don't mind language.
Yeah.
They want to articulate policies which say as plainly as you can what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And if a large minority of the population doesn't really like it, tough.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to do. And I'm really sorry.
Yeah. But this is why.
And it's horrible saying that. I mean, on the other side, for example, I think it's horrible for a politician to have to say what I believe to be somewhere near the truth, which is that our asylum policy is bedevilled by our commitment to the 1951 or whatever it is, a treaty on asylum, which says that if we have somebody comes to this shore and they've been oppressed, we will look after them.
Yeah.
We're committed to that. We are, as a matter of fact, are not going to do it. Now, it is very, very hard for very large numbers of politicians to stand up and say, I think that 1951 commitment is something which, in all honesty, we're going to have to abandon.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of a repulsive thing to say.
Because even Reform shy away from that. They sort of say things about illegal migrants as though that's the problem.
Yeah, I know.
But you're saying migration per se is actually the problem no one wants to face up to.
Yeah, indeed. And well, that is very, very hard to talk about, for reasons which, of course, include politicians being decent people.
Yeah.
And politicians, half the time at least, wanting to be generous to people who are being oppressed.
I think that's right. I think, I mean, even the people that aren't in my party who are far to the right of me, I see elements where they believe very strongly what they're doing is the right thing for the country.
Yes.
Some of them are cynical manipulators and demagogues, but some of them are just doing what they think is the right thing.
Yeah.
So go back to what you were saying. This expectation problem, does that come from perhaps not really saying anything at all, but implying that everything's going to be just brilliant, and therefore when things don't turn out to be so great, everyone piles in with their criticism? Would it be sharpened and improved if we actually just tightened political rhetoric, said a bit more candidly what we were going to do, apologise for deprioritising other things, and actually set out the trade-offs a bit more clearly?
I think so, yes. But then that gets you back to Thatcher.
Yeah.
I mean, I think your example of Thatcher is a very good one, because, of course, Thatcher, to a startling extent, has been retrospectively demonised.
Yeah.
And sort of nobody really wants to be like Thatcher, do they? Even a lot of people in the Conservative Party don't really want to be like Thatcher, because it's so sort of tough and horrible. On the other hand, she was the plainest example, except for 1945, I think, probably, where political parties set out a series of really quite specific policy proposals, which they intended to keep to, and would believe that they would keep to. When Mrs. Thatcher said, "I'm going to beat the miners," you know she meant it. She was telling a story which was true.
And I didn't sort of share her vision, but I certainly recognise that conviction.
It was truth-telling.
And also she I think was able to grasp the apparatus of the state and wrangle it into some sort of shape so it was fit to deliver that vision. It's part of the problem.
That's a different question, which is really hard, which I have no view at all on whether the civil service is fit for purpose, because you'd have to know about the civil service.
But you know about economics and political history, which gives you a unique window into a thing that politicians, I think, generally do really badly, which is learn from past mistakes.
Yes.
You very clearly feel as though we shouldn't be blaming politicians for the fact that not everything is working in this country.
I think that would be absurd.
It would be absurd, but that is sort of what's happening. What should we do instead?
Well, there is a fundamental problem which you can do nothing about, meaning only the electorate can do that, which is that things will not work if the electorate has slipped into being hyper-judgmental and hypercritical and doesn't trust anybody. If you start from that position, you've had it, roughly speaking, because there's no truth-telling or honesty or coherent planning or whatever, which you are going to be able to put into a speech. If I think that you are basically an incompetent idiot.
But that's the trap we've got stuck in, isn't it?
We're a bit near that. We're a bit near that.
So re-establishing trust actually has got to come first.
Indeed, and that, as we know from personal relationships or from life, is very, very hard. Once you get mistrustful, there's no formulaic procedure for saying, I'm very sorry I don't trust you. Can we please work on this trust thing?
So someone could rebuild trust. I think of trust as a bit like a sort of balance sheet or a bank account. You can do things that reduce trust, but you can also do things that top it up again. And maybe politicians should be looking for the things they can do now that will evidence trust. Most of which don't have any cost attached to them.
If there are such things.
If there are such things. I mean, I think the thick of it quote is that we should double the number of quiet carriages on trains. That's about as far as we can go without spending money. But there are lots of things we could change about British politics and the relationship between the electorate and politicians that don't involve big price tags. Is that where we should start to rebuild?
If we can find such things, absolutely, yes. But I think the other, it's very interesting watching any old government, actually, but including, of course, this government, because that's the one we're watching at the moment, that because it's so tough being specific, it's tough being specific in two ways. One is it's really hard deciding what to do. Saying, I'm going to do this, is it requires intellectual and practical and political determination and skills of a peculiar kind. It's very, very hard. It's very, very hard deciding what to do. And it's very hard also saying it, because when you say it, you offend half the people. Guaranteed from the start.
So this is the ultimate neck on the line type of behaviour.
Absolutely.
And you've got no control really over how it's going to land.
There is no speech I can make, even though I can assure you this is the most intelligent, well thought out, practical speech you will ever hear in your life that won't offend a third of the population. And I really absolutely hate that. And that's why, at the moment, if you listen to the Labour government is, the Chancellor, for example, talks about growth all the time. There are two things going on at the moment. One is growth, and the other is the cost of living. These are entirely vacuous notions. And there is no growth policy, because there never has been a growth policy. Growth has never been something which governments have been able to create by creating. There are particular things like being more sensible about planning, which help business. But the idea that you have a growth policy which is going to transform the rate of increase in GDP from 0.3% to 3% is just, it didn't happen in the Industrial Revolution.
But hang on, but that's just undermined the very few credible things that people are able to say when they say what they're going to do and why it's good, because it'll lead to growth. Are you saying that's just madness?
I think there are no policies which this government, certainly, and probably any other government, can formulate which can truthfully propose that we're going to increase the rate of growth of GDP from 1.1% to 1%. Nobody's ever known how to do that.
So that makes it the perfect political promise, because no one's able to prove or disprove it.
That's true.
Being slightly cynical.
Yeah.
So what should politicians be saying they're going to do, or do things?
I think that a problem is, and this clashes again with the hopeful expectation things, if three-quarters of the time, as a member of the public, what I want is this magic person, sometimes called the Sheikh, sometimes called the King, sometimes called Stalin, who is going to make everything much, much better, then I'm bound to be disappointed in you, I'm afraid, because what you're going to say is, I don't think I can give you stuff like that. What I can give you is a serious crack at getting a much better relationship with Europe. I think we can do something pretty effective about the problem of welfare. And as soon as you start talking like that, I get bored. I get bored and disappointed. Because I don't quite understand what you're talking about. There is a persistent clash between the need for grandiose claims that we will double growth
Yeah.
And that is required by my overblown expectations and my touching faith in your ability to do it.
But we can't carry on like this. That's not going to. We can't carry on with this sort of mad dance between politicians and the electorate, because isn't the only winner of that the person that's able to be the most bombastic and the most overpromising, i.e., somebody on the far left or the far right?
Well, we can't. But it's difficult to know what measures you can take to stop that. I mean, again, it goes back to the trust problem.
Yeah.
Let's say, and the trouble is all these propositions are sort of pathetically oversimplified, but if the problem includes a great deal of problem about trust, it's very difficult to go beyond saying the kind of thing you were saying earlier, quite rightly, which is we must re-establish trust.
Yeah.
If I say how, it's very difficult to know what you say next.
Yeah.
Except I will be truthful, and then into generations saying, "Oh, like poor old Starmer."
Well, yeah. I mean, but I suppose what I mean by that is being able to start with a conversation that perhaps doesn't go the way people are expecting, because you're able to allow them to speak their mind on views like immigration, for instance, and not immediately tell them that they're fantastically wrong about it, and acknowledge as a problem, and that probably is something we should talk about, and then maybe do things that are within your control. By focusing on maybe things that have not quick wins or low-cost policy areas, but just tonal things that you're able to control.
Yes.
How you're going to take your Europe example, which will quickly bore people indeed, but also it also excites a lot of people. But to be able to go and say our approach to this is going to be X.
Yes.
You could go and spend a few months actually taking that approach.
Yes.
And be able to establish at least some follow through on the promise that you've made, that that's the approach you're going to take. If Starmer stood up and said, we need a closer relationship with the European Union, but it's quite clear that we're never going to rejoin.
Yep.
So we're going to be going in on the approach that we're going to see what we can do that's of mutual benefit to us and the EU.
And which he almost does.
Yeah.
But because he's terrified, of course, that whatever he says is remotely matey with the European Union is pseudo-Remainer.
Yeah, and actually, indeed, the other third of people who would hate him and slander him if he sounded like he wasn't willing to career towards a goal of rejoining at some point in the future.
In the full-blooded sense, which of course is not available, actually.
No, the idea of rejoining is non-existent. This is
not on the list.
It's not on the list of things we can do. They've made that quite clear. Okay, so it feels like one of the things we need is a bit more candour from politicians.
Candour will do, yeah.
One of the other things we need is trust.
Yes.
We don't want to go into pitching sort of boring things that no one cares about that will sort of underwhelm people. But we also can't afford to be too overblown in overpromising where it's going to get worse. What's the role of evidence in this? Do politicians need to, or would they benefit from maybe sharing their working a bit, or actually looking at ways that certain actions can lead to the policy outcome that they've said they want to see?
Yes, but again, this goes back to Sense About Science, which I was mentioning before, which has been in the business of, I say, hoping that people, we at large, will take more account of what scientists say, because it's based on scientific evidence. And all that doesn't work badly, actually. If you look at, for example, I've been looking at the now rather old BSE event.
Yeah.
When rather early on, somebody, the Conservative government, and I've said...
But as in bovine spongiform encephalitis?
Yes.
BSE off of burgers in the early 2000s. That one.
That one, yes.
Right.
And if you look at what was done, there were essentially two mega reports on it. One was early on, which is very interesting for all sorts of political news. One was early on, when it was done by, I think, what he called Southwood or Southwell. Anyhow, very, very evidently well-distinguished, relevant scientist. And he wrote a report early on. And then later, Phillips, the judge, wrote another report afterwards when we knew what had happened. And one interesting thing, which is not strictly to my point, is that the first report by Southwell said, don't worry, it'll never... And so that, the thing that tells you is no good thinking that looking at the evidence gives you the right answer. Because in a lot of these cases, the intelligent and able scientist simply gets it wrong. But it was done very, very conscientiously. And of course, Phillips later, afterwards, said, let me tell you how evidence was, how we got it wrong. Which wasn't from not looking at the evidence, but from not being able to decide what on earth was going to happen. And my strong impression is that the availability of serious opinion through chief scientific advisors and so on, in the case of COVID and things of that kind, is really not at all bad here in as compared with other countries, for example.
Yeah, okay.
And we do that rather well, partly because we are very lucky, and it's much to our credit, that we have an extremely good university system, which is intellectually and academically grade A, and also, partly because of the war, wars are very interesting from this point of view, we have quite a tradition of being able to use technical inquiry and knowledge in order to invent radar and things like that.
Right, yeah.
So I don't, of course, one should always say, look at the evidence and listen to it. I think that if what you might loosely call the availability of evidence problem is not central to all this, I think there is a problem which you can't solve by what you might call legislation or codes of conduct, which is you can have the best chief scientific officer in the world, you can have the best scientific advice in the world, but if the politician for some reason can't bear to listen to it.
That's a very human fallibility you just brought in.
And again, or indeed the populace as a whole can't bear to listen to it. There's a limit to what the poor old scientist or the poor old civil servant or what you might call the poor old evidence-based policy procedures can do.
So let's go back to economics.
Right.
Economics is supposed to evidence outcomes based upon observations or initiatives. You said no politician has really been able ever credibly to stand up and say, here's my policy, it's going to lead to growth, because it's just such a long series of steps down the line from that policy's impact.
Indeed, yes.
If a policy objective was to say, change the profile of the tax burden, increase disposable income for average median households, and that was generally felt to be a good thing for resilience because of local spending in the economy, etc. That's not really a pro-growth argument, but it is.
It's not a pro-growth argument, particularly.
It's certainly an argument for economic resilience and the power of consumer spending and people having choice because they've got money and income. How can you evidence that using economics? How would you put that across?
Not much. Oh, God. But you see, here we go again. I think there are several kinds of optimism around. One is the king, the sheikh, or Stalin.
Solve everything. The
second thing is we have other people. We have people called experts who half the time I hate, half the time I think they're experts. So will they please tell me how we achieve X?
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And people are absurdly optimistic about the ability of, for example, economists, to say how the our economics works and what the result is going to be. I think there should be an answer to this question, which incidentally, they don't generally feel, people do not feel deeply resentful and appalled that medicine has totally failed to solve a large number of disease-related problems.
Right.
They think that medicine has done really well, good for them, and they keep on doing better. But we don't say, medicine has failed, because I've now got a list in my right hand of all the things that
it doesn't cure.
And so again, it's part of the same story, which unfortunately I have no magic remark to make about, which is that there's some reality to people's expectations, and that reality includes understanding what it is that economists, for example, or doctors can do and what they can't do. What the limits are at the moment to human knowledge. You can fantasize that there are no limits to human knowledge given infinite time. But if you say actually, what should you do now? No amount of expertise, evidence and so on is going to deal straightforwardly.
And you're talking about the problem with trying to make policy for economic growth is that's an unpredictable thing in the future, which you can neither predict, forecast, let alone intervene to guarantee.
And going back to the 1930s example, which unfortunately is too far in the past for anybody to think it's relevant. It was very interesting how then, and indeed also in the 1960s, where we had a thing called a national plan, believe it or not. It was believed that if only you thought hard enough, you could, as it were, model how an successful economy in 2 or 3 years' time would look by having these inputs and these outputs and so on. And you would push the economy into this model.
But that coincided with a period of great improvement in living standards.
But we don't know why.
We don't know why. Oh, no. Okay.
So part of this is modesty, which of course comes together. There are two immodesties round. One is the excessively immodest optimism about the populace.
Yeah.
About how these wonderful experts, who, as I say, half the time we hate.
Yeah.
They're wonderful people. They can tell us what to do, just tell us what to do. The other is that politicians quite like to pose as being omnipotent and wonderful.
Yeah.
So there are stories going on which are almost incompatible with democratic politics.
Yeah.
The democratic politics is deep down flawed.
Yeah.
Because it encourages excessive optimism about what we know and what we can do.
But doesn't it also encourage effectively delegated authority? That's where the problem comes, isn't it? Because if I'm involved in the thing that I want to make happen,
exactly.
So we've got to involve people in stuff.
I think that's a very important point. And I think that the poor old sheikh, as I call it in this story, has got two terrible problems. One is, part of his problem is that he is expected to solve it.
Yeah.
It may be a cop-out, but one of the ways of dealing with it is to say, no, you solve it.
Yeah. People.
You people.
Yeah.
North Walsham.
Yeah.
Now, of course, North Walsham can't solve the problem of the war in Ukraine, but there are many things which can be delegated.
Yeah.
Which have several consequences. One is the poor old sheikh gets off the hook for whether the bus is on time, which is an absurd thing to expect him to be able to regulate.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that the people in North Walsham get to realise this is quite hard.
Yeah.
And it isn't just the people in London being stupid.
I think a lot of people would lean in and take a bit more responsibility and burden if they were given power.
Indeed, yeah.
So there's a thing going on at the moment with a huge number of new houses being built in North Walsham, 1,800.
Yeah.
I suppose one of the unusual things about this is the town has broadly expected this for about 20 years to happen. So the question is now a straightforward one about accountability. Who's going to make sure that the new doctor's surgery comes in during the build and not afterwards or never, and various other things which the town needs.
Yeah.
But I believe naively perhaps that if you involve people in decision making, not only do they realise it's a bit harder,
which is very important,
but they might also adjust their expectations. They might be making a choice between two reasonable parameters rather than pitching something or having something pitched to them over here that's never going to be achievable.
Yeah, and when I mean, if you take the example made up by me on the basis of what you said, for example, of whether the provision of doctors' surgeries in the new areas as a result of the increase in houses is successful or not. In 5 or 10 years' time, there's one world in which it hasn't worked out terribly well.
Yeah.
And so what we say is London screwed it up again.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other one is when it hasn't worked terribly well, and I remember at the time how hard it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the second is a grown-up answer.
Yeah, and those people exist in droves in my villages and the towns that I represent because they're the ones that have been shaping the community and doing the work for a very, very long time.
Indeed, yes.
Often that includes local councillors. Especially in the last 10 years, councils have had to make decisions, trade-offs and compromises and do unpopular things for no other choice, forever. And
up to some point, and I don't know where the point is, but it's further than where we are now. It'd be better for them to make more mistakes, because it's a good idea if they make the mistakes, partly because they don't blame the poor old bloke who couldn't have done it anyway in London, and second is that they have to be grown up about how hard all this is, and they can't believe in magic.
And
they know you have to decide whether to have it on the west or the east.
Yeah.
And you decide on the east, and 2 years later you say, crikey, why did we do that?
Yeah. But so that's really reassuring, because that to me is quite hopeful, because
and doable,
because I certainly can think about some ways that we can give people more power and involvement in decision making that affects them. It's part of my credo politically as well to do that. We still need the inputs, don't we? We still need the experts, the information, the data.
We do. Yeah.
And we still need some sense of, like, why are we trying to do this? I mean, housing's pretty straightforward. We've got thousands of families on the housing waiting list. But, like, if we're going to talk about a taxation policy,
yes,
is there a deficit of politicians being able to actually add up and link politics to economics, as in not future forecasting economics, just pure practical, do the numbers add up? How are we going to afford to do this? Do we need to tax somebody else more to be able to do it?
Well, there's a very, very nasty set of problems on which I am extremely unreliable, which because I'm a very old-fashioned, which is discussion of economic policy now has degenerated into talking about how we have the Bank of England, which is independent. It controls the interest rate, and it pushes interest rates up and down according to inflation.
Yeah.
This is the most pathetic description of how you run an economy you can imagine, because it's hands off. It is combined with, well, I would call it Thatcherite, but it's slightly unfair. And it's also sexist. A housewifely idea that you mustn't spend too much.
Yeah.
And you mustn't have too much debt. And you mustn't spend a lot more than you mustn't spend a lot more than your income.
It treats the country's budget like a household
It
account.
is. Now there are, I think, complicated and, broadly speaking, correct reasons for thinking that that's a mistaken way of thinking about it. So I'm not the person to talk to, because I think that, roughly speaking, the way we think about economic policy now, compared with 1975, when mercifully economic policy was in the hands of people who taught it like me, who got it right, is just in a mess. Yes.
So don't we need to fix that if we're going to give people this power in a responsible way?
Hard. It's very, very hard, because I haven't got a story which will convince you, let alone the populace at large, that it would be all right to be a bit more like Japan or Germany and spend more.
I get it. Politicians are given far too much expectation by the voters, and there's a fundamental issue of trust. What do you think moderate politicians should do about this?
Well, you and I discussed decentralisation, and I think that of all these difficult subjects we talked about, I do think the direction of travel toward decentralisation has got a huge amount to be said for it.
Involving people in decisions. And making decisions.
And that's not because it is democratically appropriate for them to have these rights only, but it's also because it treats them as grown-ups. That's to say, it may do something to move from my caricatured view, which there's a lot of infantilism going on, where people say, can't the sheikh please solve this for me?
Yeah.
To the person having to face up to solving the problems themselves and deciding themselves whether the GP surgery is here or is there, and discovering how difficult it is to decide and getting it wrong. So I think it's educationally, in the terms of structuring the formulation of expectations, and evidently a good idea.
And are there any tips from the period of history that you know well of politicians who've managed to shake the sheikh, as in disrobe that particular burdensome expectation, just through what they've done with their own personal presentation and the way that they speak and act and lead?
No, I suppose you can. Again, Mrs. Thatcher is always interesting in this. Mrs. Thatcher, not for that sort of reason, was, of course, a decentralisation person.
Yeah.
And, of course, the market is a decentralisation device.
Yeah.
It is against the idea that the person in Moscow, or is it in London, can decide what cars you produce where.
Yeah.
So she was an arch decentraliser, involved with letting your friends make money, the virtues of free enterprise, and all that sort of thing.
So I'm not sure if we want to hand more power to a concept rather than to humans.
No.
Okay, do you feel, I mean, given what I've latched onto and responded to and what I've sort of looked aghast at, like, I'll ask you that question again. How do you feel about the period of time we're in and what we're going into?
The period we're in is, first thing which is very important to say, is that it is extremely easy to write leader pieces or headlines on Channel 4 News or whatever, saying these are times of unprecedented crisis. They are not.
There's plenty of precedent.
And if you consider, leaving aside a long time ago, but if you think of the of Brexit, which was a very bad idea, if you think of the, let's say, bad luck of the 2008 financial crisis, if you think of the 1976 IMF application, what we're going through at the moment is a rough patch.
Yeah.
And it's incidentally quite interesting, though we shall see, and I will be proved wrong, to see how little the Iranian war has actually done to the oil price or the volatility prices. It has, of course, put the prices up a lot.
Yeah.
And it may indeed put them up a lot more, and it may indeed do terrible things to the world economy and so on. But the general story over the last 6 months that we are now faced with, Iran has faced us with a world disaster, has turned out not to be true.
Yeah.
Which incidentally is a very, very important lesson, if it turns out to be right, which is the 1973 story, when the Gulf states, could treble the price of oil, and it nearly killed us.
And they did.
And it nearly killed us.
Yeah.
We're not in that world any longer because of the fact that we've switched to other renewables, and the United States set about being the largest oil producer in the world. So we're not in a period of unprecedented and appalling economic catastrophe. That said, I do think there is, again, it's sad to have to say this, it's a great disappointment that Starmer has turned out to be so uninspiring. And I say that not to be particular about his mistakes, but he's not been somebody who has enabled us, as it were, to rise to the occasion. Because in certain very important respects, he doesn't rise to the occasion himself. And it is surely likely that we will get somebody better. I don't mean somebody magically more technically competent at economic policy, whatever it may be, but somebody who enables us collectively to feel that we are maybe able to tackle these problems and do something about them. I'm optimistic about this country, partly for, again, if you compare where we are in this now with 20 years ago, 50 years, 500 years ago, for heaven's sake, what are you complaining about, really? Yeah. This is still a rich and prosperous country. So it is true that in certain of the areas like AI and so on, what it turns out to be one of our major strengths, which is, roughly speaking, universities and in intellectual life, we are really good at.
Yeah.
And we have got a lot of strengths. Now, whether those strengths are strengths which require state intervention or fostering or whatever to take advantage of whatever, I'm not sure. But I think we are, quote, quite well placed in the new world, where it's those skills that are grade A skills.
So the voting public might need to strap in and lean in and step up in order to be part of this.
Yes, indeed, yes. And also it wouldn't do any harm. This is terrible sort of psychotherapy. It is not very interesting to say people should have realistic expectations and stop being infantilized, and then to say the next Brexit, much more, they should be more cheerful. And the trouble is, what you need is psychotherapy. You want? I'm not quite sure that runs. It is sort of true that we are again, and it does go back to the self-importance generated by being the country we were in the 1950s.
Yeah.
50s, which is having a proud past, which has since then plainly not been so good, and rather like France. France had exactly the same problem. And I do think there are various things about our history and how our character has developed, which make us prone to self-importance, optimism about what expectations you can legitimately have, and being over judgmental about the people who let us down.
Well, getting stuck into solving a knotty problem,
indeed, yes,
would be a great remedy to that.
Yeah, and of course we all know from what you might call real life, ordinary life, that if an organisation or a group gets pissed off, judgmental, resentful of their leaders and their colleagues, and disappointed by life, they're not going to do very well. And it doesn't really matter whether they're right or wrong. There is a bit of pessimism, feeling failure at the moment.
And that needs charisma to
it needs
give people the right sort of optimism. The self sort of equipped agency optimism.
And,
I can do this.
And we all know, leadership, unfortunately, like words, the cost of living and growth are just sort of phrases, really. But leadership does include being the kind of person who, for some reason or another, I believe, you sort of know what you're doing. And you sort of know what you're doing. I think you're pretty much on my side, and I think you might be able to pull it off. Now, what on earth gives me that belief? God knows.
That's the right sort of optimism, though.
That's the right sort of
qualified,
optimism. And you have to
judgment-based
more
optimism.
or less have that optimism.
Yeah.
And indeed, you almost have to invent it.
Yeah.
If you're going to do well, you have to pretend that you believe that.
Yeah. I think that's about as close as an economist is going to get to being optimistic. So we'll bank that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining me.
Not at all.
Really good to see you. I kind of assumed that Jeremy was going to tell me 10 lessons we can learn from politics throughout history and perhaps explain to me why we need to focus the country on economic growth and how to get there. But instead, he kind of trashed that whole idea and ended up in a place that's much closer to my political credo of thinking that actually, if we really want people to have more realistic expectations from their politicians, we need to help them get more involved in the process of politics, to be at the table when decisions are made, particularly decisions that are made locally to them. And I feel cautiously inspired by the fact that I think that is something we can do. We may not be able to deliver on the ludicrous expectations that have been set by decades of promising and under-delivering. We may not be able to immediately re-establish trust that's been lost gradually over that time, but we can have conversations with people, we can take politics to them and help them design the solutions that are going to make life better, at the very least, for their families and their local communities.